Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, Nino. How are you?
Very well, Carlos. Good to see you. I trust you're in sunny Bangkok.
Yes, sun's coming up from your direction here in the east. Nice warm
Excellent.
morning again. Waiting for the rainy season. We have a big holiday coming up here next week. It's Songkran. It's basically the Thai New Year. It's the time when you probably see
Oh,
everybody brings out their water guns and firing
oh,
water
yeah.
at each other to
Yeah, that's what they
cleanse.
call. I remembered seeing that in southwestern China. They called it Water Splashing Day, I think.
I didn't realize that. Well, not
Yeah.
surprising. They
But
somebody
I think
stole
they were.
something from the other.
It's a region of China down there in Yunnan province, which I think is ethnically Thai.
Yeah.
And but yeah, very, very, very colorful festival down there, as I recall.
I'm going to be out there on the streets with my camera. So today we have a very interesting topic, which I mean, frankly, looking at the way we've sort of thought about this, there's multiple, kind of sub threads that this thing can go in. So let's see what we can cover today. Hopefully it'll be crisp and interesting. And if there's rich other veins, we'll go there. So you want to kick off the first topic?
Yeah, sounds good. So today we've covered in previous episodes kind of a playbook for value creation or activating new investments, we called it. We then talked about the board as kind of the main vehicle for governance of investments. And I think it's a fitting topic for our third episode to really sort of zero in on the CEO, which clearly plays an absolutely central role in driving all this. So today's really kind of focus on the CEO. As with all of these topics, as we get into it, we might identify, specific areas where we want to dig deeper later. But today we thought, let's just do sort of an overview of best practice around CEOs. And so I think the topics that we want to cover, starting really with the role of the CEO in private equity investments. Then we'll talk about what makes great private equity CEOs and, drawing, I guess, from our experience of good investments and having worked with, no small number of both great and poor and probably a whole bunch of mediocre CEOs. And then we'll talk about how to find and attract and install the right CEO. Kind of a set of solutions, I guess, for that large set of topics. And then we'll talk about assessing CEOs and kind of performance managing CEOs as our fourth topic. And then kind of we'll wrap up with, when CEOs need to be replaced, when things haven't worked out right. I think that's a fraught period for any deal team. Emotions run high, and I think, very effective to have kind of a playbook for kind of how to manage that sensitive process. So that's kind of the overview of what we hope to cover. We might branch off, as you said, into a few areas, but really starting with the role of the CEO. Carlos, how did you guys think about that in your investments?
Yeah. So what I'd say is here I really want to juxtapose, because every business needs a leader, regardless of ownership structure. So obviously we're talking about private equity, and with a unique Asian flavor. I think that I have found, and I've seen so many different models of the way the GP and the CEO interact and kind of balance each other. But what I would say is, the number one value creator in any successful private equity investment is that selection, deployment, and optimization of the CEO. It's nothing that the GP does in terms of engaging inside the business. Obviously, the way the deal is priced, finding the deal, that's all separate discussion. But in terms of the success of the company, it's all about the CEO. And and we talked before in the last episode about the board. I mean, it's okay for the fund, for the GP to chair the board. It's not the ideal model. It's certainly better than the CEO, chairing the board. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this, kind of what I call king for a day. I want I would counsel that the fund and the GP has to play a very limited role. And so, in the context of the board, that's really where they can exercise true governance and, let's say, oversight of the CEO. And that's it. I think any other, let's say, leadership demonstration from the fund has to come behind closed doors. And we could talk about how that works, but maybe I just want to put that out as an opening volley.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we spent a fair amount of time, and I think, it was a worthwhile exercise to really define the decision rights across the CEO and by extension management on the one hand, and then kind of the non-executive, the role of the GP, the role of the board as kind of an extension or, appointed representatives of the GP. And really what it boiled down to, I guess, maybe at the risk of oversimplifying it, is it's really the role of the GP to obviously, make that initial investment decision. It's the role of the GP to kind of, underwrite the deal. What does success look like? And kind of define the what around the deal. And crucially, it's a decision right of the GP to be able to appoint the board or the board chair and to appoint the CEO. And pretty much all of the other like how-to decisions around defining a strategy of how we get to our ambition, how we resource the team, how we allocate capital kind of within the confines of the P&L. These are best, thought of as really kind of responsive authorities that rest with the CEO. And so having that kind of clear demarcation line around decision rights, we found just, removed a lot of ambiguity from interactions.
Yeah, and think absolutely. Think about the those early days when you have especially when you're bringing in a new CEO, and we'll talk later about the incumbent versus the new CEO and that. But the way messaging is received by the organization between the fund, who's going to be new, and CEO in this case is going to be new, and how people, how the team is looking for signals about where the real power lies. And I've seen situations that poorly handled where the let's say the deal lead or maybe the ops lead from the GP has a strong personality and a strong conviction and, sort of stewing this deal for a long time and just eclipses the CEO and some CEOs, get sort of immediately like neutered and subdued by that. And I've seen, and that's a terrible way to get things off and running. So I think it's very important that the GP folks at senior levels be very conscious. They're there as I call them consigliere, right? They're there behind the curtain, behind the closed door, providing that kind of, counsel. And they should be tough with criticism, but behind closed doors, not in front of the team.
Yeah, there's probably more to be said about this, but just in brief, I guess one of the key ways in which I saw this go awry was, bringing on board chairs who really hadn't had non-executive experience. All of their experience was, the bulk of their experience was as CEO, as executives. And finding it very difficult to kind of restrain themselves, to hold back from that instinct that they have to kind of be the decision maker. So, cultivating the right bench of board chairs who know enough about what it is to be a CEO to be dangerous, but have also learned that complementary skill set around, the nuanced role that a board chair has to play is critical in terms of kind of giving the CEO the runway that they need to be effective.
Yeah, totally. Well, now we're veering back into our last episode, but I would say you're making another argument for why I think CEOs who are also playing the chair role is bad, because of course they're in their DNA, executive leaders, and then now they're sharing a board, and so now everybody's neutered around the table, and that's not productive. We covered that last time. I just want to get your reaction to the thought about mentoring. I mean, first time CEO, there's always a first time for everything, and if you've had experience in your deals where you have a mentor deployed, as a professional outsider, I think where I've seen that work, first of all, it has to be done, very like low key. It has to be done in a way that the CEO actually wants to do that,
Yeah.
and sees merit of that. And somebody who is, I think, professional, not just a random person from the GP. Have you seen that model work ever?
Um, I have seen, effective coaches, mentors. I think, the best board chair CEO partnerships that I've seen had a strong element of kind of coaching from the chair, who was typically a slightly more, seasoned, kind of, had experience across multiple companies and deals and so on. And so the best board chair CEO pairings that I saw featured that element. Um, I think in general, the best CEOs that I have the chance to work with, kind of 201, were humble and hungry for perspective, and availed themselves at every opportunity of that kind of support, and didn't see it as a threatening thing. Whereas certainly I had my fair share of, and I think you and I maybe had a joint experience with a CEO who was, who didn't quite react that way and had a bit more of a defensive kind of streak. And I don't know, there's something, I feel like, the truly great CEOs, and probably, irrespective of PE or whatever the ownership structure is, I think great CEOs are confident in their role and confident in their position enough to then be able to just avail themselves kind of greedily of all that kind of resource.
Well, you're absolutely right, and it's a perfect segue to the next topic about secrets of a successful CEO. And for me, it's a long list, and we could talk equally about the converse, right? But there's probably a whole episode about even more broadly about what makes for great leadership. But maybe just kicking this topic off, you want to go first, and share your and maybe two or three things, and I'll add to that, and we'll have a big list, I'm
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I think it'll probably grow to be a fairly long list, but I think if there's one characteristic that to me is what's needed, certainly in a private equity setting, where there's enough of a time frame, there's enough time in the life of the investment to really be transformational, but not enough time to kind of take your time about it, right?
Mm.
Time is absolutely of the essence. And so there's an element of relentlessness across all of the aspects that I think, again, kind of defined like the great CEOs that I worked with. And it was often a quiet relentlessness. It wasn't like a frenetic, over caffeinated kind of drive everybody crazy sort of relentless. It was just a quiet persistence on the things that matter, and just continuously bringing focus back to those things. So what were those things? I guess a couple to get us started. One is, relentlessly build a strategy and refine a strategy that ideally is exceeds the underwrite, and just relentlessly be pushing the team, to be aiming for something that if the underwrite is for 3x, these were the great CEOs were the ones who were engaging their teams around like a 4x future. And once the strategy is in parallel with with defining and refining the strategy, is relentlessly driving execution. And then I think the third thing, and then I'll shut up, would be something around relentlessly raising the bar on talent, and what it means to be an A player in the organization. So I guess those three things are maybe top of my list.
Those are great two things, and I have somewhat not different take, but I think there's another actually. It's a great list. For me, communication is really critical, and especially when we talk about a new CEO in the context of that company, new to the company. I mean, so repetitiveness and simplicity, and driving teams home, in different channels, different venues is important, and that relates to strategy. I've seen it said many times in my career that great strategy is not about elegant 5D chess. In fact, it's actually something that's very simple that can be communicated and that can be understood throughout the entire organization, so that it's actually embraced. Because strategies don't get executed on their own, and so communicating about strategy and about priority, it's strategy about priorities and means and ends, as we all learned in school. Being relentless about that communication is very important. And then maybe to your relentless point about I've always used the term rhythm. There's got to be this unwavering cycle. It depends on the business. So businesses have, by their nature, different, sort of cadence given how they interact with customers in the marketplace. But basically, every week certainly, and every month there are some natural intervals, and like clockwork, these are opportunities to review performance in the business, fulfillment of the strategy, and performance against targets that are the flow from strategy. And then, of course, with review of those things is the goal setting and the cascading of goals. I can go, and there's lots of discussion about goal setting and rewards associated with that. But yeah, rhythm. To your point about relentlessness is that you never break the rhythm. What happens maybe daily, but certainly weekly and monthly, and so that it becomes part of the fabric.
Yeah, I think the point about communication is very well taken. I think it's private equity, especially. Well, I mean, I guess there's definitely a unique flavor to the communication that's needed with a GP. So between between the CEO and channeling kind of the management view and championing the management view with the GP is one set of moves, and then translating GP wants and requirements down to the organization in a way that's constructive, and managing that process in a relatively friction-free way was probably I guess implicit in your point, that probably is the hardest thing about being a PE CEO. Presumably you come to the role well qualified, the industry, you've been a leader, you know how to motivate and build and deploy teams, et cetera, et cetera. But being able to kind of have that dual track or dual language sort of ability to translate. In fact, I'm reminded of Sandy Ogg, who was kind of an influential figure to us as a GP. I'm sure you can find lots of videos about Sandy's work on YouTube, online. But so he had a whole schematic of the unique role of the CEO, which was kind of, they sit at the head of the management table, kind of, if that's a circle, and then they sit at the other side of the board table, and so they're kind of the nexus point between those two. If you can envision maybe a figure eight, which I think summarizes well the nature of the role, and to be effective in that role, it's really kind of at least two jobs in one. Any thoughts from you about like the Asia spin on this? I think a lot of what we've talked about probably is pretty universal. But I think there were certainly Asia specific or market specific areas of emphasis or whatever that might have been a bit unique to Asia. I might have one or two as well, but why don't you start us up on that?
Yeah, I'll be actually a little contrarian in the sense of let me set this up the right way. So what I have seen, in nearly 30 years out here, is there is definitely, in terms of management styles and leadership styles, there's definitely a directional bias towards to use the wrong word, but directionally, authoritarianism. So strong, decisive leadership, singularity of that leadership. And I actually find that's um, uh, expected and welcome, but it's also it can it's so handicapped or is so expected that it can be less effective than the opposite, which what I would call engagement. So having the CEO, again, especially a new CEO, CEO new to a company, um, actually out there and in a listening mode, and especially in the beginning, I found that the best listeners, the best CEOs are the best listeners. And there's a phrase, management by flying around. So actually being out there within the organization and with customers, and in particular B2B to ministries, being very empathetic and engaging with customers and in a listening mode. Now, of course, the customer is God is a very Asian concept, so that is consistent there. But just more broadly, rather than the worst thing I've seen is the CEO locked in the room, like emitting, smoke clouds of directives. On the contrary, I find that CEOs who are out there touching the people at all levels, and in particular, not just their level. I mean, I'm talking about skip level. I think there's a whole theory about skip level engagement and how that works. But just being out there, being engaged, listening, I think are great qualities, and are relatively short supply in Asia. That's why they're that much more impactful.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think there probably is a bit of a misconception, right? That in Asia, these more rigidly hierarchical, whatever, structures are more the norm. And I mean, they might be more prevalent, perhaps. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily more effective than
Indeed.
flatter, more customer centric, more engagement sort of focused organizations, which also exist in Asia. I guess the thing I was thinking about was so I had the chance to work with obviously a number of deals that were in Asia for Asia, and then a couple of deals towards the end of my career more where it was kind of Europe or US centric businesses who were expanding into Asia, and we were kind of doing that reverse cross border thing. And what I found, I guess, was that teams in Europe, teams in North America were generally, it was easier for them to know how to operate with a like a proactive GP, and they were able to make more. They were able to utilize better the resources that a GP might have in terms of advisors or like an ecosystem of support. Whereas I found that in more of the Chinese or Japanese teams, that was the bulk of my experience. There was more of a risk of confusing the organization around who's calling the shots, and so what I found to be effective, or what was needed to be effective as a CEO in that circumstance in Asia, was like a CEO, again, back to your point about communication, who was able to be kind of bicultural in that sense and be able to kind of, identify and bring on and then deploy those kinds of resources in a way that they were kind of additive to his or to his or her agenda, but not sort of confuse the organization about, kind of what the role of the GP was, or what the role of the executive team was. So that was something that I felt, at the risk of overgeneralizing, I thought was maybe more of a feature of organizations in Asia.
Yeah, well, I think certainly that it requires a level of it's called EQ, um, touch, the ability to introduce these ephemeral interim advisory quasi engaged roles into the organization, And of course, those individuals who are playing those roles have to be very skilled at um, adding value in a way that is ultimately appears as everybody pulling oars in the ship together in the same direction. So yeah, I think that model is it certainly in a longer historical context. That model is unconventional in Asia, but I've seen it work. I think you and I probably embody those roles in many situations. And but yeah, it does take a certain skill, and I think but I think it's so fresh and so it can be very impactful if done the right way, and it requires both the leader and the other folks around them to be pulling in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah. It may have to do with, I guess, just the asset class being less established, in Asia, much more widespread in the
Yeah,
West. Anyway, so I think that's a good sort of overview of what makes a great CEO. Um,
it's a
uh,
start.
it's a
To be
start.
continued, probably in some other package.
That's right.
Should we talk about finding and attracting CEOs and rewarding them and the
Yeah,
right fit?
that's right. I mean, I think
Um,
maybe if we start with the point about fit, like, so, I mean, clearly, as part of doing the deal, as part of underwriting the deal, there's probably a pretty clear sense of what the aspiration for the future state of the business, the exit state of the business is going to look like, and therefore, what are the value creation drivers, and therefore, in addition to obviously the industry and the market, the marketplace that we're competing in, that value creation blueprint is something that the right CEO is going to have a very high level of familiarity with. Um, and so, getting that right, I think, has a lot of value. Being specific about that, is very valuable. Um, but on the other hand, and we spent a lot of time trying to develop kind of a process for doing that, as kind of an operating group, and sort of advising our deal teams on kind of crystallizing that, like, it basically is kind of like a job spec for the CEO, as it were. Um, but I think one mistake that I think we made as a result of that, and it was particularly kind of thrown in sharp relief during the pandemic, is what's the saying about great plans that come into contact with reality? I mean, I think we live in an era of just an increasing amount of unpredictability and just unforeseen events impacting our businesses. And so, maybe underlining or underlying all the specific sort of, industry and kind of functional kind of requirements that a successful CEO might need. Like, a foundational thing is, are they resilient? Are they adaptable? Can they pivot? And are they enough of a leader to be able to, to weather, if not several, at least one or two, fundamental shifts in the marketplace during their tenure? Anyway, what's your reaction to that?
yeah, I mean, so on this fit question and situational question, and you touched on the resilience in the face of unforeseen events. I want to come back to that, what I call the wartime CEO, uh, because sometimes there's I've seen peace and tranquility, and then war happens when you least expect. I mean, maybe that's you really want to go into it in a war situation, but it's that which is requires the most resilience. But I have kind of a list of situations that I think are unique and that are important that the deal team be very conscious of in CEO selection. Not in any order, but I mean something like there are some deals that are basically industry strategy driven. It's all about developing a differentiated winning strategy to pull ahead of competitors, and that really requires a lot of industry depth. That's one. Another is called the good to great evolution, which often comes with a family most of the family businesses, with maybe one exception I can think of, that we've bought from are actually well-run companies. They just had their limitations, capital limitations, talent limitations, and then turning that good to great in that evolution. That's another. Ugly turnarounds. And sometimes you go into it because you're buying it for a song. And I've been through a couple of those. We went in with our eyes wide open about how difficult it's going to be. Sometimes it's this. We'll come back to the resilience thing. It's the stopgap. It's the solving for a crisis that's time to find. But other very different sort of archetypes. So carve outs. I've been involved in at least one of those where there were a parent company that were dislodging a unit and creating a standalone business. Sometimes with that is bringing the company to market. So making a private business, bringing it to the public market, that's requires a whole different set of skills. And in all of these different types, and there's others I'm sure I'm missing. It's important to select the CEO who's at least been close to, if not led the way through one of these scenarios. Forget about their specific industry experience or specific geographic, whatever experience. These are different situations that command or require different skills, and that has to be a kind of a filter, I think, used in selection.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful framework. And I guess just listening to you talk through that, I guess the one kind of motion or play, I guess, that we would sometimes run is kind of a scale, kind of bolt on, type, consolidating a fragmented market. Where again we had a couple of those where we had CEOs come in who weren't necessarily dyed in the wool in that specific subsector. They had familiarity with the general market space, but really what they brought, to your point, was the playbook or the ability to sort of identify, transact and then fold in, subscale acquisitions kind of at a rapid pace. But yeah,
Yes.
and so what you would do then with those kind of plays in mind is kind of use that effectively as the selection criteria and have CEOs who
Is
are kind of
selection no criteria? Yeah,
right.
it's something to be just very mindful of. What is the situation we're going into in those and that list and others? Yeah, I mean the roll up, as you described it, the roll up deal, the one that does also require another skill set. And again, there's other archetypes, but that should just be a filter. So, having said that, there's other things to consider in CEO selection, and maybe I would introduce one, which is, how should I say, familiarity, i.e., the fund, the GP being familiar and comfortable with the CEO. Everything else equal. I mean, I think that there's a lot to be said for what I call the farm system, to use an American baseball metaphor. Having folks out there that you have, or the bullpen system, right? Brought in from the bullpen. You've seen them, tough situations, different situations, and I think the best GPs out there cultivate that network of CEOs who become advisors, who become CEOs, and they come in and out of situations, and you know what to expect. And probably the very best CEO that I can think of, I had to pick one, is somebody who was a serial offender in a good way, with the GP, and was just enormously successful and was just a known quantity. That's the ideal world, but that requires effort on the part of the funds to cultivate that network, which is a whole discussion in itself.
No, well, it's so I think that's a good kind of segue to kind of a sub point here on finding and attracting the right CEOs, is like sources of great CEOs. And I think you put your finger on probably the most effective, which is you've got a bench, right? The second being maybe you inherit an incumbent. We can talk about that a little bit more. And then the other is, how do you set yourself up for success when you're calling, when you're picking up the phone and calling a recruiter? You're just kind of like looking for one in the market, which is probably the most challenging, but I think there's learnings on how to do that and how not to do that. But to the point about the bench, I think we had the same experience. That was, harder to pull off by far, but much more predictive of success. Um, and I think when we kind of turned a corner on being able to see that be more a regular part of the program is when we made the commitment to not be sort of sector generalists, but to have like a group of 3 to 5 really core sectors that we were going to focus on. And it took a good 3-4 years, to really kind of get that moving, and to really kind of build the depth in the deal team and with the advisory, network, and with a good successful couple of deals under our belt in each sector. But you reach kind of a tipping point, once you do get a couple of deals, and the LP community becomes enthused about it, and it becomes part of the brand. And at that point, it really kind of becomes a virtuous, kind of cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one this farm system or network cultivation. I mean, you're right. It's more challenging because of the nature of the supply and demand of the leader talent. I think where it actually works quite fluidly, that I've found, is in the CFO role, the finance leadership role, where and this is where certain generic skill sets about finance. Of course, they vary in different industries, but it's somewhat more functional in nature. But also the CFO's keen understanding of what makes the GP tick and how to make them not happy, but how to make them comfortable. And having done that successively, and I saw it on a recent situation where it was a multi-use CFO. I've seen it a couple times, and that I think really works well. These CFOs can have a bright future just circulating, from deal to deal. So I think that works.
Yeah. So, by way of kind of parking lot for future episodes, I think the PE CFO is probably a pretty deserving topic.
Indeed. But before we leave we are talking about compensation or awards, which is that again is probably a whole discussion. Do you have any just headline comments about the compensation?
Sure. So, I mean, I think to me, I was thinking about that in the context of like, how do you effectively attract, the right candidate, regardless of how they come to you. Compensation certainly is maybe that's kind of the kind of the first level of the foundation. I would say, clearly it's a combination of salary, equity, and co-invest opportunities. And there's benchmarks available for all of these things. But I think, typically, I guess the way we thought about it was, it's about creating wealth creation opportunities for CEOs and for the top management team. We would typically include sort of 10 to 15% of the equity upside in our underwrite. Let's say we were underwriting a 3x. So, 10 to 15% of that 2 turns above entry value, we would set aside as the management equity plan. And then, and in some cases, we would underwrite, like if we go above that, if we go to 3.5x, there's a trigger where the percentage of the pool becomes larger. Obviously, the quantum becomes larger, but the percentage actually becomes larger.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of the way we thought about it. And then typically we would have, I mean, I guess there was a range, but it was somewhere between a quarter and a third of that equity pool was typically what we thought of as a healthy allocation to the CEO. And with the remainder being distributed to the rest of the management team. We were very liberal, I guess, with our with our offers of co-invest, and so we would typically allow our CEOs to invest like on a no fee basis, the same kind of terms that the partners in the firm were able to enjoy. So that's kind of
Great test too.
yeah. Sorry.
Indeed. I was just saying, yeah, on the same terms, peripecic. What you just said, I think that's perfect, because you were picking up this topic about equity compensation from a macro standpoint, i.e., from the top down. What is the value creation overall that we want to ascribe to or reward to the CEO? And then maybe from a micro standpoint, think about equity. I'll work backward to cash. Equity, I think, there is various forms of grants. Let's just say, I think co-invest is really important. I mean, what you mentioned the opportunity to co-invest, and I always say that in deals I want to be involved in. I want the opportunity to co-invest, but with that is also kind of the obligation to co-invest.
Yeah.
Because what I don't want is CEOs who enjoy the upside reward potential from an option or a an equity grant, and not have the downside risk that all of us face as investors. And that's the virtue of having them co-invest a meaningful part of. It's a year's worth of cash compensation or something in that neighborhood is not unreasonable. And having that at risk, I think, is very virtuous. And then, and so what I've seen work is have that as the baseline, that co-invest, and then have a sweetener, so that when certain objectives are met, and you could look at that either bottom up or top down, when certain objectives are met, the value of that co-invest, call it cost basis from the CEO standpoint, is enhanced. That's how I think about the equity portion of it. And then
Yeah.
Go ahead. Please react.
No, I was going to say, I was going to echo your point about, really, as far as the GP is concerned, there's kind of an expectation that the CEO is going to co-invest, like a meaningful amount of their personal wealth into the deal. And that's situational. Like what constitutes meaningful is obviously very situational, but that was a conversation that was always had actually at the investment committee level, when we were talking about, underwriting a deal. We've got a CEO waiting in the wings, ideally. And that was always a conversation about, what is the co-invest, as a question being asked by IC members.
Perfect. I mean, it's clearly, it's a topic that should get the most attention. In terms of CEO rewards, and then on the cash side, so of course there's salary, and then there's we used to call it STIPs, short-term incentive program, basically an annual variable compensation. And I think that's let's face it, most CEOs, CEOs globally, in both public and private companies and all kinds of companies, have been driven CEO cash compensation up over the years, and they always say, "Oh, gee, it's a competitive marketplace," and da da da. I rarely find CEOs, turn down great great company leadership opportunities because the cash compensation was not there. And these are people who usually have had long careers where they've been well compensated. So I think on the salary basis, for example, we found that not going past sort of the 80 percentile, so having the industry benchmarks and having some distribution of CEO salaries, and not being higher than the top 20 percentile, conversely, of that distribution is kind of a good place to land. And then STIP should be in quantum terms, it could be half of that amount to three times that amount, probably roughly in that range. And of course, it would be tied to company financial performance, which is fundamentally overperformance compared to underwriting, and individual, we'll call it KPI realization, and some mix of those things, evaluated once a year. and those two things working together.
Well, maybe that's the right point to sort of jump into evaluating CEOs. And like one of the things that I recall, as we were kind of making this transition to really focus on talent and kind of put structure around talent optimization across the portfolio, one of the things that we started to introduce was CEO performance reviews. And I remember it engendered all kinds of allergic reactions from members of the deal team or pockets of the deal team, thinking it was a very sensitive subject, and these should be things that are done kind of behind closed doors between the deal lead and the CEO, and they're more art than science. But we kind of chipped away at it, and over time, I think, kind of brought the organization around to thinking that there is real benefit to ensuring that robust conversations happen around expectations, breaking those expectations down into kind of individual chunks, and then, measuring progress against that and linking that to compensation. And what we found was that actually, as we had more and more of a population of board chairs kind of amongst our senior advisory group, they kind of insisted on having this mechanism, not because they wanted sort of like a short leash over their CEOs, but they just found having a framework like this that was endorsed by, in fact, required by the GP, kind of just it kind of plowed the road for them in terms of, creating the conditions for them to have, sometimes difficult, but always, kind of pointed conversations about expectations. Anyway, so it was a bit of a journey, but, one that was very worthwhile. What was your experience with CEO performance review?
Yeah, well, we both had the experience of the cautious and ginger touch that deal folks tend to have towards upsetting CEOs. Look, I think I came from GE to the private equity industry, and I think GE in the '90s had a great rhythm and system for talent and CEO performance and cascading throughout the whole organization. And there are a lot of elements of it, and I think that I actually, I guess one of the early GPs I worked very closely with, I had a bunch of ex-GE people, so they understood how that model worked. But I think, it's the more transparent, the rules and the process around it should be very transparent. The audience of folks who are participating in that should be limited. I think it is sensitive. So, but it's not the deal lead with the CEO and those two people behind closed doors. But it's not a circus either. In fact, that's the benefit of having a human capital or executive compensation, whatever you want to call it, committee within a board, is to have that limited session of folks who are going through that process. Again, I'd say it's not limited to CEO. It should focus on, kind of the results versus potential, results versus attitude, for want of a better word, and risks around the CEO. I mean, there's a lot of elements of it, which is probably something of a longer discussion. But yeah, that's for me non-negotiable, and it would, at least from the board's perspective and from the GP's perspective, it should extend to the direct reports to the CEO. So there's transparency there. And then the CEO themselves, with their human capital leader, will replicate that down into the organization. The fund doesn't need to be involved that far down, but I think that all works. It's pretty well established.
Yeah, no, you're right. It does set the tone. It sets the tone at the top and creates the expectation that we're going to set specific and measurable objectives for ourselves. We're going to hold ourselves to account to those objectives. We're going to ensure that incentives are in place to drive that kind of behavior, and we're going to drive that across the whole organization. I think the board has an important role in kind of setting the tone about that kind of thing. So that begs the. Oh, sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, yeah. So just a thought came to my mind. I was in one situation where that whole process hadn't matured, and the let's say the board had the bright idea, in quotation marks, of bringing in a third party CEO assessor, which I found actually created a pretty uncomfortable dynamic because it felt like some kind of intervention, right? Like
Yeah.
you bring in the guys with the to put you in a padded room or something. I mean, I found that my point being, let's not make it unnatural. Let's not have bring in some fancy consultancy to do this thing. This should be routine annual business that ultimately results in a decision about the CEO's maybe next year cash compensation, but certainly the
Yeah.
short-term incentive, what's their bonus payout, which of course then creates the bonus pool. That's a whole big discussion of bonus pools and all that. But yeah, that should be something that's done internally in the board, maybe in the executive committee of the board.
Yeah, no, I never had the experience of outsourcing that to some sort of advisor. I can't imagine it working well, to be honest.
And
Yeah. But so
um,
once you've instituted that kind of a process and you're kind of evaluating your CEOs, I mean, one of the benefits of that is that certainly my sense was deal teams often were reluctant to recognize that a change needed to happen. And it happened, in quite a few deals. I mean, probably on average, I'd say more than 50% of our deals, it probably approached 2/3. We had some sort of leadership transition at some point, during the hold, or at least a leadership transition became a relevant topic, over the course of the hold. And I think the inertia, the kind of the energy typically in a deal was to try and stave that off as long as possible, by which time often like considerable damage had been done. And so, I guess there's a whole I guess the topic I want to have with you, the discussion here is around like, how do you catalyze the right conversations around knowing when it's time to move on? And how do you kind of make that process, as effective as possible? What was your experience?
yeah, so we definitely have shared the experience where, let's say, guys who were in roles like we played saw the need for change sooner than the rest of the broader deal team around the investment. Um, I want to maybe pick it up from another angle, which is, there are difficult situations, and sometimes, you have, and we talked before about the resilience and the flexibility of CEOs to deal with external shocks. So sometimes external shocks happen, and some CEOs are very adept at responding to them. And I've seen like the best, in a couple of cases I can think of, and I wish I could name the countries and deals, but where the CEO just toggled to crisis management and did it superbly. But yeah, that's a real skill. But yeah, and the failure, and sometimes the abject failure in the face of crisis, is a reason to make a change and to go find that wartime CEO that person is not presenting. But I guess one point I wanted to make was, I've also seen situations, even in the course of the typical 4 to 6 year private equity buyout holding period, where there's been not one but two, sometimes three changes of CEOs. And I'm not saying that's the kiss of death. And I've seen one deal I was not so close to in another GP recently that's actually turned out to be salutary. They found the guy finally who's really making things happen. But I think that the wear and tear on the organization from the multiple change on balance is negative and should be avoided. So in other words, if you didn't make the right, it's like marriage, I guess, maybe in my case. If you didn't make the right choice the first time, make sure you make it the second time, because things start to erode after that. What's been your
Yeah, no, I've certainly seen that once or twice, and I guess you think about like what are the root causes there? Is it lack of clarity around what we're really looking for in the CEO? Is it I've seen situations, well, one in particular I'm thinking of where the underwrite, kind of that the motion around value creation was so complex. There was divest non-core assets, and then there was kind of focus on this core of the business that we really wanted to grow, but that was kind of a niche business in a different sector where the previous center of gravity had been. And then there was reinvent that core to be more of a SaaS business. I mean, it was basically, three different value creation theses rolled up into one, where
Yes.
good luck finding the one guy that's gonna, deliver all of that. So diagnosing like what's going wrong is probably something that we weren't always great at.
Yeah, it's interesting. You remind me of this situation where in the post-mortem of a deal that was uh, under returned, certainly, I'd say, the view of one of the very wise senior deal leaders was, that deal went awry because the underwriting, called for real fundamental strategy changes in the business model of this business along different dimensions. And okay, that's fine. But to attract a CEO who has that level of skill set, you need a much bigger platform who would attract a much bigger CEO. This is was a, let's call it a $125 million revenue business, in that kind of order of magnitude. And, in a very specific kind of industry, you're just not going to attract this kind of, heroic superstar who can navigate their way through this big business model changes in a limited period of time in that kind of space with that kind of reward structure. And so we bit off more than we could chew. So yeah, sometimes it's also about, your ambitions in attracting a CEO with a certain expectation should be sized to this, scale of the platform that you're bringing them onto, and that you can afford that kind of challenge.
Yeah. I think the other thing, though, in terms of sort of going back to the core question here of like, how do we enable the organization, meaning that how do we enable the GP to move more quickly on moving on and replacing underperforming CEOs? I think one of the things, and it sounds quite obvious, it is quite obvious, but one of the things that was important for us to learn how to do was to bring a solution rather than just identify the problem. And so it kind of gets back to that longer term, construction project around sector expertise, advisory network, a bench of, really good executive chairs and other non-executives that you've kind of got at your disposal so that you can go to a deal team that's presumably, and they were always aware that something was not right. It wasn't like we were, as an operating partner coming to them and telling them something they didn't fundamentally realize. Typically what was holding them back was the specter of the chaos on the other end of making this decision, a vacuum of leadership. And so once we had built, and it did take, I want to say a good 36 months of consistent effort across several geographies. But once we had built out, for, our top couple of sectors, a decent stable of advisory executive or non-executive, previously executive talent, we had optionality around being able to deploy some of those people. And all of a sudden, kind of the stress levels around some of these conversations just tangibly went down. And you just have, there was just more concrete conversations that you could have with people other than we need to make a change. Let's call a headhunter, that never tended to really kind of fly particularly well.
Yeah. That's definitely such a cringeworthy situation when you're basically, exactly, you have a problem, the problem festers, you don't have a solution, and then desperately reach out to blindly into the marketplace, get your favorite headhunter to bring some magical solution. And that takes time. And then, of course, that's another important thing. It's like when you don't start this type of process of succession when the crisis has been, already in your hands for some months already, because it's gonna be months before you get the right person in, if you ever do. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure what else we want to cover on this piece of it, other than there's one thing I was thinking about this kind of special context, especially when you bring in either this CEO who's new to a company or comes during the course of a holding period, is when very often the best CEOs have a kind of a crew, folks that they've worked with at the next level in different companies. And I think, we talked before about familiarity and everything else equal. I think there's a lot of merit to having this, team that have passed the ball around amongst each other in different situations. But it just requires some care, especially in a crisis, in a wartime situation. It requires some care for that CEO with their crew that comes in to have a skill set that doesn't create a kind of either apartheid or a nervousness on the part of the incumbents, even the incumbents who were brought in by the GP, at the beginning of the deal. It doesn't create a kind of anxiety that now there's this, secret society that exists within them, and in this time of crisis, they're going to be marginalized, i.e., the folks who were already there. I don't know. You see the situation of I'll call it the crew.
Yeah, no, it's a dynamic that we saw pretty much every time that you have a new CEO come in kind of mid hold, or even a new CEO coming in at the beginning of a hold, and they're going to typically want to deploy their trusted, they're going to want their trusted crew. I mean, it's a dynamic that I think it's important to be aware of. But back to the point about decision rights, I mean, at the end of the day, we might be squeamish about that, but if we're, again, to your point about those are, to the extent that the deal team or the GP has familiarity with the business, and that perspective might be helpful to the CEO to help them navigate, those conversations are best done kind of, out of sight of obviously the rest of the team. And ultimately it has to be the CEO's call about how to maneuver.
Totally.
The board chair, I think, in their coach and advisor role to the CEO, probably has the most relevant role to play in kind of shaping that for success. But I think, ultimately it's a dynamic that I've seen go wrong. But it's ultimately on the CEO to make that work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally embrace that. Yeah. I mean, I raised the points of caution, but it goes back to our first principle, which is the CEO is, the singularly is the most important lever, and their autonomy has to be respected. Though it could be counseled in a private setting. I see we're coming to the 1 hour mark. I mean, maybe we just a hair past it. What else do we wanted to cover? So.
Well, I think that does cover a lot of the bases. I think there's a couple of other subjects that I think I might have had on my original list that we didn't get around to talking about. One was, when you do need to do an executive search for a CEO, I think there's best practice around how to manage that process effectively. But that actually might be a standalone, mini episode or something down the track.
What I would say, is maybe that just to round that other that subsequent episode around is talk about them in general. Talk about the talent cultivation process, not just the one-off get the CEO through the headhunter, but the constant cultivation of talent, at different levels. Functionally, business unit-wise, strategy, whatever it is, that I think is a rich topic.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we've both got a lot to say about that. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is, and I'm guessing you might be simpatico to this as well, like having come out of a corporate, like institutionalized GE, Mars, whatever, these kind of big institutional businesses, where we were all about development of leadership and talent development. And to me, like one of the real kind of jarring things coming into private equity is like it's less about development. It's not zero on development, but it's much more about talent identification and talent configuration because you really don't have the
Yeah.
time, right, to develop a pipeline. If you're working on developing a pipeline, you've kind of missed it, in a 5-year time frame. So, but anyway,
Yeah.
I think there's a real, yeah, that's a real rich sort of vein to mine, I think.
Okay. So we'll definitely come back to that. And there was a second point that you were saying that we missed out covering today.
And I think it was
I
the
know.
point I was going to make was around, yeah, those sources of CEO identification. I think the one thing that we didn't talk about specifically was, oftentimes you come into a deal and you've inherited an incumbent, and kind of like how to view that. I don't know if we want to spend maybe just 3 minutes
Let's
on
take a
that.
couple of minutes on that.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think we talked. Go ahead, please.
yeah, no. So like, I guess what the notes that I had on this were, again, oftentimes kind of the default setting of the investment team was like, we like the stability around the incumbent. Are they going to be up to the task of, you know, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the business? Well, we're not sure. That kind of dynamic I saw quite a number of times, and I guess the kind of the hard won experience, I guess, that I drew from those experiences was like, in Marshall Goldsmith's famous phrase, like what got you here won't get you there. Like
Yeah.
typically, like the incumbent is kind of wedded to the kind of the past trajectory of the business, and often are just not the right are not the right people to catalyze the business to take it in a different direction. The exception to that I saw in a couple of cases, one in particular was a big education deal where you had an incumbent who saw the potential of the core platform, was constrained by the previous shareholder structure, was frustrated. We kind of endorsed that incumbent's vision for a rapid growth plan. We made the investment, backing this incumbent. That worked out very, very well. But that was a pretty, there was a couple of cases that kind of shared that characteristic, but they weren't very common. And so, again, my general experience was, as comforting as it is coming into a new deal with so much going on, okay, we can bank on this guy. We think, like I that always wound up being a situation where we said, gosh, if only we had done something 18 months ago.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably first of all, this decision about do we retain the incumbent or not is obviously a huge part of the diligence and underwriting. And it's not something like as an afterthought that you weigh on the first board meeting, of course. And I know that's been your. I think maybe the only difference is I've probably been in more situations where the default setting was to actually bring in a new CEO as part of the underwriting. Now, let's just contrast this with the incumbent situation of two kinds, right? One is the incumbent who's just there, who was managing the business, versus the founder of the business. And obviously, there's there's a lot of merit in founders and now giving them a stronger platform. Of course, you presume they've been successful. This is a good to great story, and so you want to now put real wind in the sails of that founder. But of course, there's two edges to that. I mean, the founders have a bunch of intrinsic power that's very independent of the GP, and that has to be done thoughtfully. So, I think there's two kinds of incumbents, but yeah, I think probably I've had more of a bias to bringing in somebody new, and that then brings us back to our whole issue about selection and rewarding and all that.
Yeah, I think to the point about, you're exactly right to draw that distinction between those two scenarios. And I think with the incumbent founder, just about all of those examples that I worked on fairly quickly, we wound up basically elevating the founder to a senior advisor or a non-executive role, not chairman typically, but a board member. And then with a new CEO. I mean, typically that was kind of the formula that seemed to work out the best. Whereas with the incumbent, who's just the CEO, I can think of one case where for stability reasons, whatever, we decided we wanted to keep them around, but it wound up being very distracting. And they had their little power base. It just wound up being a distraction to the organization. But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, there's probably not a, you know, ipso facto rule about, incumbent versus new and all that. It's you need the right leadership for the right situation. And a lot of the topics we just talked about before, but selecting a CEO, I mean, part of the selection process is selecting an incumbent. It's getting that right CEO in the right situation that reflects the situation. We had our list of situations before, the context of that deal, what is expected, how the underwriting should go. And of course, we talked before in other episodes about, having the CEO actually underwrite the underwriting, I mean, and, being part of that, owning all of that. And that's an important test. But
yeah.
yeah,
Well, I think that definitely covers a lot of ground. But as with all of these topics, it's like we've identified a lot of surface area that potentially extends out into lots of other areas that we could potentially talk about, to come in
yeah,
future.
we need to take the capsule to the dark side of the moon now, in keeping with the events of the day, and examine the world of, among other things, examine the world of talent network management. As an ongoing mission, and as it applies to specifically deploying individuals into specific situations. So we'll come back to that. Nino, anything else to wrap up before we?
No, I think I've enjoyed the conversation as always, Carlos. Good to compare notes. And to our audience, please, let us know in the comments below what you found helpful, anything, that we touched on that you'd like to hear more about, any suggestions. We're hungry for your feedback. Like, subscribe if you'd be so kind, and we'll see you next time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nino.